A major shakeup tonight at Boeing after a string of scary incidents involving the aircraft. The company's CEO announcing today he will step down.
China's government has reportedly ordered its domestic airlines to stop accepting deliveries of Boeing jets and to halt purchases of aircraft parts from the U.S.
Overnight machinists at Boeing here in St. Louis are operating without a contract agreement.
Workers have voted down a recent offer, and the current agreement expired at mid.
A move that initially hardly made headlines sparked a storm that is currently developing in American industry. The aerospace behemoth Boeing, which long represented American dominance in the sky, discreetly announced intentions to shift some of its manufacturing to Mexico. What initially appeared to be a business plan quickly descended into a political conflagration. In a swift and forceful reaction, the White House threatened to impose a 200% tariff on any aircraft constructed outside of the United States. Now, Boeing runs the risk of being excluded from the very market it helped create. How did one of the most prestigious corporations in America find itself facing off against its own government? And how would this conflict affect international trade in the future? There was silence at first. Before words change everything, there is a crushing quiet. A line that held the weight of an entire industry was spoken by two individuals who were separated by vision, but bound by power. The President of the United States is at one end. On the another, the CEO of Boeing, the corporation that had flown the American flag for decades. Sharp words, a collision of pride, and the beginning of a war that would soon spread far beyond that call, all without counselors, cameras, or spectacle. The scene was set for a conflict that would put strategy, loyalty, and survival itself to the test. The tension persisted after the call ended. The volume increased. Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg refused to compromise. Under duress, instead he made a public statement out of what may have been a private disagreement. Financial markets were rocked by Boeing's announcement that it would shift a portion of its assembly line to Mexico, and Washington was immediately incensed. The reasoning was straightforward for Boeing. Change was required as a result of years of financial hardship, safety incidents, and the constant push of international competition. However, politics rarely makes sense, and the White House quickly drew lines of battle. It was a quick and harsh response. Before reaching domestic buyers, the administration announced that any aircraft that were not manufactured in the United States would be subject to a 200% tariff. It was a direct attack on the safest market for Boeing. America had served as Boeing's home base and defining characteristic for many years. The business was now obliged to leave the very area it had helped define, which was unfathomable. Ortberg didn't retreat. He made a forceful statement to the world. Instead than being influenced by politicians, Boeing's strategy would be driven by competition and survival. The fight became something bigger because of that stubbornness, a query on whether businesses were still allowed to choose their own course. The conflict only grew more intense at a time when politics permeates boardrooms behind closed doors. Halls were crowded with lobbyists. Politicians disagreed on what loyalty meant in a cross-continental economy, while economists argued over results. The response became ferocious outside of Washington. Some argued that national allegiance should take precedence above profit for American businesses. For Boeing, however, the choice was unrelated to leaving the country. In a world where rivals like Airbus swept ahead unhindered by political constraints, it was a matter of survival. After that, the conflict ended. Boundaries. A 125% charge on U.S. aircraft was imposed by China, one of Boeing's largest clients, in retaliation. Overnight, deliveries froze. Planes worth billions of dollars languished in warehouses with no buyers, their wings grounded. In a televised statement, the president charged Beijing with breaching agreements and escalating the conflict. What started out as a business choice now drew countries into direct conflict. The harm spread widely. There was unexpected uncertainty for hundreds of suppliers of engines, avionics, and supplies. Transportation companies rushed to change their routes. Contracts for aviation led to the development of cities. Futures in places like Wichita, Kansas, and Everett, Washington darkened virtually overnight. The dispute between Washington and Ortberg was more than just a news story for the towns whose livelihoods were reliant on Boeing. It posed a risk to salaries, to households, to whole communities. Ortberg changed tactics since he didn't want to abandon Boeing. He declared that the corporation would reroute its stranded fleet to new customers in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, markets that are less constrained by political pressures and eager for expansion. There was no mistaking the message. There would be no cornering of Boeing. It would find a way to continue operating, even if it meant rethinking where its potential clients could be located. Survived. Early in 2025, that risk started to pay off. In the first quarter, deliveries increased to 130 aircraft from 83 the previous year. Revenues nearly reached $20 billion, an 18% increase. Even though the business was still experiencing negative cash flow, Ortberg was certain that Boeing will improve its situation by the end of the year. He seemed to have saved Boeing from the abyss for the time being. However, triumph was anything but safe. One of Boeing's largest European customers, Ryanair, sent out a strong warning. It would switch to Airbus or possibly China's Comac if tariffs caused costs to increase. The caution brought to light a more profound reality. Reliability and affordability were more important to airlines than political showmanship. Customers would leave Boeing if company came to represent political danger. This incident exposed a problem, bigger than Boeing itself. The question was now the same for all international corporations. How can the expectation of national allegiance be balanced with global flexibility? Because the response was direct. It was not betrayal to expand. It was a matter of survival. Executives from a variety of businesses agreed with his position. Leaders at Ford, Tesla, and Apple are all dependent on foreign suppliers. Many see Boeing's resistance as a model for their own struggles with government pressure. Deeper wounds continued to cast a shadow over Boeing's trajectory. Statistics by themselves were unable to mend the scars left by the 737 MAX disasters and the terrifying mid-air panel detachment of 2024. They weren't written off as mechanical defects. They were viewed as betraying trust. Customers questioned Boeing's dedication to safety, and when confidence is betrayed, it's the most difficult asset to restore. Boeing's vision for a new space frontier, the Starliner program, struggled through one set of setbacks after another. The situation was highlighted by malfunctioning thrusters, helium leaks, and a humiliating trip in which astronauts had to leave Boeing's capsule and board SpaceX's Dragon to return to Earth. Boeing's reputation in space would completely collapse if it couldn't stabilize its commercial aviation division. Airbus continued its unrestrained advance, expanding its reach and signing new contracts. Boeing had to maintain enough global freedom to compete while holding on to the enormous U.S. defense and aerospace contracts that tied it to Washington. The level of scrutiny from lawmakers increased as they questioned if Boeing's approach was in the best interests of the country. Every decision had significant political ramifications since federal projects worth billions were at stake. Trump and Ortberg's initial phone conversation quickly evolved into more than just a story. It came to represent a change in authority. Previously private corporate decisions have become national issues that influence markets and even international policy. Every aspect of the industry was impacted by the tariff conflict. Logistics firms prepared for new routes, investors re-examined timeframes, and parts suppliers modified their schedules. A large, interconnected system was in disarray due to a single executive action. The vulnerability of the aviation industry was clearly seen. Years of preparation, thousands of parts, and many laborers were all undone in a few days by a political order. It's unclear if Ortberg's stance will be viewed as audacious rebellion or fearless leadership. However, airplanes were never the main aspect of this dilemma. It was about identity, politics, and economy colliding. It demonstrated how susceptible even the biggest businesses are in a society where governments now hold sway. Not just with soldiers and legislation, but also with trade wars and tariffs. One fact was unavoidable as the dust started to settle. Today's businesses must decide between strategic independence and political compliance. In addition to influencing earnings, that decision will determine how international trade develops in the future. The answer will be revealed by Boeing's actions in the upcoming chapter of its history, not by speeches. A case study on company survival and the vulnerability of the global economy has emerged from what started as a tariff threat, supply chains, as well as in the fight for autonomy. Boeing's battle serves as both a warning and a precedent in a time when national borders and commercial goals no longer coincide, and as other industries, such as semiconductors and medicines, recalculate their own trajectories. It demonstrates how a single choice may have a profound impact on markets, governments, and entire communities, and that a company's resilience in the face of power and politics is just as important as its financial performance. The news moment. The White House's response to the disclosure that Boeing was thinking about moving some of its manufacturing to Mexico was swift and harsh. Trump declared that if the idea proceeded, every foreign-built aircraft would be subject to a crippling 200% tariff before they could be sold in the U.S. During this altercation, Ortberg had a direct conversation with the president. According to reports, he emphasized the symbolic significance of initiatives like Air Force One and promised that Boeing's aircraft will be in line with national aspirations, would keep up with the strictest cost, safety, and efficiency requirements set by the U.S. government. The phone call's specifics were never made public, but the general message was widely understood in boardrooms and government offices. Boeing could not ignore the growing needs of international markets, but it was also committed to preserving its shaky relationship with Washington. It was unusual for a chief executive to publicly confront a sitting president, rather than through secret negotiations, a remarkable departure from custom. It was quite uncommon for a CEO to dare to push back on this magnitude in the history of corporate America. This was a calculated gamble with potentially disastrous repercussions based on how investors, authorities, and foreign consumers responded in the coming months. In times of dispute, big businesses typically choose to remain silent and release statements using carefully crafted neutral language, while real discussions take place in private and in silence. Boeing made the decision to take a different path. The corporation sent a message that retreat was not an option by refusing to back down. It would only become evident as the repercussions spread throughout the industry whether this would be viewed as a daring gesture of leadership or a careless gamble. However, one thing was for sure. The decision would not be overlooked. The emergence of rivals that won't stay in the background is making Boeing's position even more difficult. Comermac from China has been progressively establishing a footing, particularly in areas like Asia and Africa, where there is a growing need for mid-range aircraft that use less fuel. Already firmly established as Boeing's biggest competitor, Airbus has been leveraging its standing as the less risky and politically involved option. Because of the growing competition, Boeing's problem extends well beyond temporary tariffs or pressure from the White